For decades, I've studied the intersection of economics, power, and democracy. Today, I want to unpack what's really happening with Canadian steel, who benefits, who bears the costs, and how this episode illustrates a much larger shift in global economic leverage. At first glance, it looks like Canada is on the defensive. A massive U.S. tariff hits Canadian steel. The predictable scenario unfolds on paper. Canadian producers face higher costs, prices climb, layoffs hit steel workers, and the government faces pressure to concede to Washington's trade demands. Historically, that's how coercive trade pressure works. The larger economy squeezes the smaller one, and the smaller one bends, or collapses. For a Canadian steel worker facing layoffs just as the holidays approach, this isn't theory. It's livelihood being leveraged in a game they didn't choose. But here's where the story diverges from expectations. Ottawa's response wasn't reactive panic. It wasn't improvised last-minute messaging. It was strategic, and in some respects it had been in motion long before the layoffs became public. The government had anticipated this pressure months earlier. Instead of depending almost entirely on American auto manufacturers, Canada quietly began building a transition strategy, channeling hundreds of millions of dollars into stabilizing key steel producers, coordinating with provincial authorities, and laying the groundwork for production lines focused on domestic industries that are expanding rather than contracting. If you're looking at the headlines alone, it might seem like political posturing, but the mechanics reveal something deeper, a pivot that could redefine Canadian steel, reshaping its markets, pricing, and leverage. Tariffs are more than political theater. They affect the goods you buy, the jobs in your communities, the bargaining power of workers, and the long-term stability of entire industrial sectors. For decades, Canadian steel depended on U.S. auto production. It worked, until it didn't. Tariffs instantly disrupted a business model built on efficiency and profitability. Past governments might have sought carve-outs or retaliated with counter-tariffs, hoping to pressure Washington into negotiation. But this time, Ottawa's first question wasn't about diplomacy. It was internal. How can Canadian steel remain viable without depending on U.S. purchases? That question marks a fundamental shift. Once you stop treating tariffs as temporary shocks and start viewing them as catalysts for structural independence, the economic landscape changes. Investments previously labeled as bailouts were, in fact, bridge funding, money to stabilize companies while they retool for new domestic markets. Instead of exporting raw steel to the U.S., production lines are pivoting toward shipbuilding, infrastructure, and defense contracts, markets where Canada controls the spending, timelines, and competitiveness. Foreign tariffs become far less threatening. This isn't hypothetical. Orders are already coming in from Canadian shipbuilders, tied to multi-billion-dollar federal projects. For mills, this represents not a temporary hedge, but a long-term rewrite of operational assumptions. While the transition will be painful, especially for workers caught between old lines and new production models, the result could be a more resilient industry, insulated from external shocks. I want to pause here for a moment. If you live in a steel town right now, you may feel like these strategies are abstract and distant while your immediate reality, paying bills, keeping your job, supporting your family, is urgent and painful, and that's valid. Old production systems often contract before new ones expand. When a government restructures a critical industry, workers often bear the brunt of that transition. The real test of leadership is whether governments cushion that blow. Strong unemployment support, retraining programs tied to actual opportunities, healthcare that isn't lost with a job, and investment in affected communities. That's what distinguishes temporary crisis management from deliberate, strategic economic planning. Ottawa appears to be aiming for the latter. Funds are not just compensating losses, they're enabling a retooling process, shutting down outdated lines, investing in modern equipment, and securing contracts for entirely different markets. During the transition, demand doesn't disappear, it shifts. Canadian steel is aligning with sectors undergoing expansion: housing, naval modernization, infrastructure. These are domestic priorities insulated from foreign political fluctuations, offering predictability absent for decades. And predictability is leverage. Tariffs work because the targeted country depends more on the foreign market than vice versa. But when internal demand and alternative markets are cultivated, That asymmetry disappears. A tariff that once caused havoc now becomes background noise. The threat of economic coercion loses its teeth. Countries that reduce dependence on single markets consistently emerge stronger, not weaker. Yes, transitions are painful, but they create resilience. Economic independence isn't abstract nationalism, it's the foundation for stable jobs, reliable wages, and vibrant communities. Diversification ensures a country doesn't crumble when someone else controls the basket. And for workers, that matters most. Workers didn't cause this. They followed the system, contributed labor, and trusted it would provide security. That system is showing its fragility, and those at the front lines are paying the cost. But the transition underway, however imperfect, is an attempt to build something better. An industry serving domestic needs and more resistant to external political shocks. The government's responsibility extends beyond funding companies. It must protect workers, communities, and livelihoods through retraining, health coverage, and economic stabilization. Without those measures, transitions become human catastrophes, not economic opportunities. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. What's happening with Canadian steel is part of a global trend, the realization that over-reliance on a single export market creates vulnerability. For decades, global trade operated under the assumption that open markets, stable partnerships, and predictable supply chains were reliable. That model is breaking down. We see it in semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and now steel. Supply chains stretched across continents are fragile. One political dispute, one pandemic, or one policy change can suddenly make essential goods scarce or unaffordable. Governments are rediscovering a simple principle. You cannot outsource everything and maintain economic sovereignty. You need domestic capacity in critical sectors, not to isolate yourself, but to ensure that your economy has a foundation resilient to shocks. I call this strategic economic independence. It's not protectionism for profit, it's resilience for people and society. It ensures workers have predictable employment, communities remain intact, and governments retain control over essential industries. The Canadian steel strategy illustrates this principle in action. By building domestic capacity and diversifying markets, Ottawa is prioritizing long-term stability over short-term appeasement. And that's crucial because steel isn't just a commodity. It's the backbone of infrastructure, defense, and manufacturing. When the steel sector is resilient, it protects housing projects, shipbuilding, and critical industrial supply chains. Conversely, when it's vulnerable, the ripple effects touch millions of lives, not just in Canada but globally. Economic leverage is shifting. Tariffs used to work because the smaller economy depended heavily on the larger one, but when internal demand and alternative customers emerge, the asymmetry flips. Canada's steel industry is cultivating domestic markets, which blunts the impact of external pressure. This changes the rules. A tariff is no longer a weapon, it's background noise. And with that shift comes bargaining power. Canada can negotiate on more equal footing, not because it's threatening retaliation, but because it's no longer dependent on a single buyer. Let's be clear, this transition is not painless. Workers in steel towns face real hardship, with layoffs, financial stress, and uncertainty about their future. The old system is contracting, and the new one isn't fully established. But strategic investment during this gap, bridge funding, retraining programs, and infrastructure contracts, creates a pathway toward a more sustainable industry. Over time, the benefits will include more stable jobs, stronger communities, and a steel sector that isn't held hostage by foreign policy whims. This story also teaches a broader lesson about how we design economies. Too often, policy prioritizes efficiency over resilience. Companies chase short-term profits by relying on a single market, offshoring production, or concentrating power in a few hands. Workers, communities, and the long-term stability of industries are treated as externalities. When the system fails, ordinary people pay the price, while corporate executives and investors reap the rewards. The Canadian response demonstrates a different approach, using government action to redistribute risk, support transition, and invest in resilience. Funding is not simply a handout. It's a tool to stabilize the industry while creating capacity for growth in domestic markets. This creates a steel sector that can endure shocks, serve public needs, and support economic security for workers. And this principle extends beyond steel. Across critical industries, energy, semiconductors, healthcare, countries are starting to recognize that overdependence on foreign markets is dangerous. Building domestic capacity ensures that economies remain functional under pressure and that workers and communities don't bear disproportionate costs. Economic security becomes a foundation for broader social stability. Now, let's consider the political implications. Economic insecurity feeds instability. When workers and communities are exposed to shocks they cannot control, trust in democratic institutions erodes. People begin to see the system as rigged, their voices as meaningless, and political elites as serving everyone but them. That erosion of trust creates fertile ground for populists, demagogues, and simplistic solutions, which can destabilize societies. Canada's strategy, by contrast, aims to rebuild economic trust. If the steel industry becomes more resilient, if employment is stabilized, and if communities have a foundation insulated from external shocks, this strengthens the social fabric that democracy depends on. Economic security is not separate from political stability, it's foundational. When workers feel secure, they are more likely to engage constructively in democratic life. Let's also look at the structural vulnerabilities revealed by Trump's tariffs. It's easy to blame a single policy decision, but the truth is deeper. Canada's reliance on U.S. auto demand was a problem decades in the making. Vulnerabilities accumulated over time: concentration of production, lack of domestic market development, and policy decisions favoring efficiency over resilience. Trump's tariffs exposed these weaknesses. They didn't create them. That distinction is important because solutions must address structural weaknesses, not just individual triggers. Building domestic capacity, diversifying markets, and investing in strategic industries are responses to systemic issues, not short-term shocks. These strategies matter regardless of who occupies the White House, because volatility is now the new normal. Tariffs, sanctions, supply chain disruptions, and climate-related shocks will continue to affect industries worldwide. Countries that build resilience now will fare better. Those that rely on predictability will be caught off guard. Workers' welfare is central in all of this. Economic transitions sound abstract but are deeply personal. Jobs, wages, healthcare, and community stability are at stake. The current system treats labor as disposable, while capital moves freely and risk is socialized. When industries restructure, the costs often fall entirely on workers and communities, while executives and investors benefit. That imbalance is neither natural nor inevitable. It is the outcome of policy choices and structural design. The Canadian approach, by contrast, shows that government intervention can redistribute risk more equitably. Investments are not only about preserving industry, they are about protecting people, maintaining community stability, and creating long-term resilience. Properly executed, this approach demonstrates that economies can be designed to serve society, rather than exploit it. Now, let's expand the lens even further. What Canada is doing with steel isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger global recalibration. Countries around the world are recognizing that over-reliance on external markets creates fragility. The same lessons from steel apply to semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, energy, and critical raw materials. Supply chains stretched across continents are vulnerable to political disputes, trade wars, or sudden policy shifts. One disruption can ripple through entire economies, making strategic independence not just desirable, but essential. Strategic economic independence doesn't mean isolation. It doesn't mean abandoning trade. It means creating a domestic foundation that ensures essential industries remain functional, even in times of global volatility. By investing in domestic steel capacity, Canada is reducing its vulnerability while still participating in international markets. Domestic demand, government contracts, and diversified production lines provide stability that pure reliance on exports cannot. For workers, this is a profound shift. Job security, wage stability, and community resilience are all directly tied to economic independence. When an industry relies on volatile foreign demand, workers face constant uncertainty. Layoffs, wage stagnation, and community decline become predictable consequences. When the economy is structured to serve domestic needs first, workers gain leverage, communities gain predictability, and industries gain resilience. The political implications are equally significant. Economic insecurity fuels political discontent. Communities left exposed to shocks are more likely to lose trust in democratic institutions. They begin to see the system as rigged and feel their participation carries no weight. This dynamic creates fertile ground for populism, extremism, and social instability. A resilient economy, on the other hand, strengthens trust. Predictable employment, stable communities, and security against external shocks give people a foundation to engage meaningfully in democratic life. Economic policy is not just about growth, it's about sustaining a functioning, stable society. Trump's tariffs exposed Canada's vulnerabilities, but they were not the root cause. Dependency on a single market and lack of domestic diversification were decades in the making. The tariffs acted as a catalyst, not a creator, of instability. Recognizing this distinction is essential. Solutions must address structural weaknesses, not only short-term triggers. Investments in domestic capacity, diversified markets, and resilient supply chains respond to underlying fragilities. These solutions remain relevant regardless of who sits in power, because volatility is now the baseline, not the exception. Globally, countries that fail to recognize this shift risk repeated shocks. Nations that invest in domestic resilience, diversify suppliers, and strengthen internal demand will fare better in a world of increasing uncertainty. For industries and governments, the lesson is clear. Efficiency cannot come at the cost of stability. Profit margins matter, but they cannot undermine the economic foundation that supports people, communities, and democracy itself. This recalibration also highlights a critical point about governance. Policy choices determine who bears risk and who reaps reward. Without deliberate intervention, the costs of restructuring fall disproportionately on workers, while benefits accrue to executives and investors. Proper industrial policy redistributes risk, aligns public investment with long-term strategic goals, and ensures that the people most affected have a voice in the process. Without such governance, economic transitions become social catastrophes. For Canadian Steel, this means that government funding must come with conditions, commitments to worker retention, wage protections, and long-term investment in domestic supply chains. Without these safeguards, public resources can simply become corporate subsidies, while workers continue to bear the brunt of economic instability. Industrial policy must prioritize accountability, transparency, and alignment with public interest to truly build resilience. Now, let's talk about lessons for other industries. Critical sectors like energy, technology, and healthcare face similar vulnerabilities. Reliance on foreign markets, supply chain concentration, and policy fragility make them susceptible to external shocks. Governments can take a page from Canada's approach, identify vulnerabilities, invest in domestic capacity, diversify supply chains, and create conditions for sustainable employment. Strategic investment today prevents crises tomorrow. Economic resilience is also linked to democratic resilience. When people feel secure in their jobs and communities, they are more likely to trust institutions, participate in civic life, and support democratic norms. Conversely, economic fragility creates alienation, distrust, and political polarization. Strategic industrial policy, therefore, is not just about economics. It is about strengthening society and sustaining democratic institutions. The Canadian steel transition is instructive, but it also underscores the human dimension. Workers are caught in the gap between old production lines and new markets. Layoffs, financial stress, and uncertainty are real. Governments must provide robust support during this transition. Retraining programs, income stabilization, healthcare access, and community investment. Without these measures, structural reforms can easily become social disasters, eroding trust and stability rather than building resilience. Finally, this is a moment to reconsider how we define economic success. It's not enough to measure GDP growth or shareholder returns. True success must include worker security, community stability, and resilience against external shocks. Policies that achieve these goals build economies that serve society, not just markets. The Canadian steel example shows that governments can intervene strategically, protect workers, and invest in long-term stability without abandoning international trade. It is a model that prioritizes people, community, and democracy, not just efficiency and profit. As we watch these developments, the questions we must ask ourselves are: who benefits from the current system? Who pays the price? Are we building an economy that withstands shocks, serves communities, and strengthens democratic institutions? Or are we perpetuating fragility and inequality? The answers to these questions will shape the economic and political landscape for decades. Canada's approach is not a complete solution, but it is a blueprint for how to start building a more resilient, fair, and sustainable economy. This is the moment to pay attention, learn from it, and demand similar accountability and foresight in other industries and countries. Economic policy isn't abstract. It directly affects workers, communities, and the functioning of democracy itself. Canada's steel transition is a small but powerful example of what it looks like when long-term resilience is prioritized over short-term expediency. And that is a lesson that the world and all of us need to take seriously. As we pull back and look at the bigger picture, Canada's steel story offers lessons far beyond its borders. What's happening here is a microcosm of a global shift in how countries think about economic security, resilience, and strategic independence. The era of blindly trusting global markets for stability is over. Tariffs, sanctions, supply chain disruptions, and political shocks are now the baseline. Governments and industries that fail to adapt will face repeated crises, while those that prioritize diversification and domestic capacity will emerge stronger. This is especially relevant for workers. Economic policy, too, often treats them as disposable, while allowing capital to move freely across borders. In traditional models, when a factory closes or a plant is idled, workers bear the entire cost. Executives walk away with bonuses, shareholders are insulated, and communities collapse. But Canada's approach shows a different possibility, a system where public investment cushions the blow, where retraining programs provide pathways to good jobs, and where the economy is oriented to meet domestic demand as well as global markets. When workers are protected, communities thrive, and the economy stabilizes. Strategic economic independence also reshapes power dynamics. For decades, Canadian steel depended on the American auto industry, giving Washington leverage. Tariffs were devastating because dependency meant vulnerability. By investing in domestic capacity, diversifying markets, and building internal demand, Canada shifts the balance. Economic coercion loses its effectiveness when the threatened party can meet its needs internally. This principle applies across industries and borders. Resilience comes from reducing dependency, not just reacting to crises. It's crucial to recognize the human dimension. Workers laid off during this transition face real financial and emotional stress. Economic restructuring isn't just a matter of numbers. It affects families, homes, healthcare, and communities. Governments have a responsibility to mitigate that pain through strong social safety nets, retraining opportunities, and support programs. Without these measures, even well-intentioned structural reforms can become social disasters. The difference between success and failure in economic transitions is often whether people are supported through the change. Looking at the political implications, economic vulnerability drives political instability. Communities that feel helpless and exposed are more likely to lose faith in institutions and be drawn to populist or authoritarian figures promising simple solutions. Strengthening domestic industries, stabilizing employment, and building predictable economic systems isn't just about money. It's about reinforcing democracy. When people feel economically secure, they are more likely to engage with institutions, trust government, and participate in civic life. Stability in the economy directly contributes to political stability. Trump's tariffs were the trigger, but the underlying vulnerabilities existed long before his administration. The problem was structural: reliance on a single market, lack of domestic diversification, and concentration of economic power. Canada's response is addressing these deep structural issues, not just reacting to a short-term policy. Investments in domestic capacity, diversification of markets, and long-term strategic planning are responses to systemic weaknesses. They remain relevant no matter who is in power, because volatility is now a permanent feature of the global economy. Globally, The stakes are high. Countries that fail to adapt face repeated economic shocks, while those that build resilience will gain leverage and stability. Industries like energy, technology, healthcare, and critical materials face similar vulnerabilities. Lessons from Canadian steel, domestic capacity, internal demand, diversification, apply broadly. Strategic investment today prevents crises tomorrow. Resilient industries protect not just workers, but society as a whole. Finally, the story of Canadian steel underscores a critical truth. Economies exist to serve people, not the other way around. GDP growth, corporate profits, and shareholder returns are important, but they are meaningless if workers, communities, and democratic institutions are left exposed. True economic policy centers people, balances risks, and creates stability. It aligns public investment with long-term goals, provides accountability, and ensures that the benefits and burdens of economic change are shared equitably. In summary, Canada's steel transition is more than a response to tariffs. It is a strategic investment in domestic capacity, economic independence, and social resilience. It illustrates the importance of prioritizing workers, communities, and democratic stability over short-term expediency. Other countries, industries, and policymakers would do well to study this approach. Economic shocks will continue to arrive, but nations that build internal strength and diversify their economic base will emerge stronger. Those that don't will remain vulnerable. So, as you watch headlines about tariffs, trade disputes, and industrial policy, ask yourself, who benefits? Who pays the price? Are we creating systems that protect workers, communities, and democracy? Or are we perpetuating fragility for profit? Canada's steel story shows that a different path is possible, one where economic policy serves people, not just markets, and builds resilience for the future. This is the lesson we need to carry forward, not just in steel, but across all industries, nations, and communities. The choices made today will shape the economic and political landscape for decades, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Thank you for watching. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening in the economy, please subscribe, like, and share this video. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and your thoughts on these issues. Understanding these dynamics is the first step toward demanding policies that protect workers, strengthen communities, and build an economy that truly works for everyone.